Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading responsible business issues inside the European Parliament, I lead our discussion of the latest developments in relation to corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, disclosure of sustainability impact of product rather than at firm level. Can we really believe the sustainability claims about products? Or is this actually the way to incentivize transition and to balance the needs for sustainability disclosure with competitiveness for the company? To discuss this whole new approach to sustainability disclosure, Brian Hill joins us. He's lead author of the study on product level disclosure just produced, entitled Squaring Disclosure Regulation and Competitiveness from Business School and École d'École HEC Paris. Brian is Academic Director of the Inclusive Economy Centre in Sustainability and Organisations Institute at HEC Paris, and also Research Director at the French National Centre for Scientific Research, CNRS. Brian, a very warm welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before we get on to product level disclosure, a question I often ask my guests: you're a leading academic in sustainability, but how in your life or your career did you first get involved in sustainability?
Yes, so thanks for the question, Richard. I've probably been dabbling in issues related to sustainability, so environmental and social issues, since as long as I can remember in my academic career. I've worked quite a lot in social choice, which is the domain in which Amartya Sen won his Nobel Prize. I've worked an awful lot on uncertainty, how to decide in the face of uncertainty. That's brought me into the domain of communication of uncertainty between, in particular, climate experts and decision makers. And recently, I've worked on people's social attitudes, so particular attitudes to social characteristics of products, again, clearly related to sustainability. So I don't know if there's not a point where it started. It's just been there always.
Well, anyone who quotes Amartya Sen in their first answer is okay by me. Now, product level disclosure, it is what it says on the tin, right? But I think to anchor this discussion, let's have a very simple introduction. What is product level disclosure and why is it a better way of doing things?
Okay, starting with the hard questions, I reckon. So there are two things. There's what product level disclosure currently is, and what it could be, what it should be. Those two things are not necessarily the same, right? So let's just stop for a second to talk about the kind of the potential of product level disclosure. So it is what it says on the tin. It's providing information about sustainability characteristics of products at the level of products, right? So rather than the level of companies. And when you look at quite a lot of the debates today about different types of disclosure regulations, product level disclosure, it starts with an advantage, right? So just take the competitiveness debate. If you're asking for a disclosure at the level of all products, then that's going to apply whatever products on the EU market, whoever's made that product, however big that company is, where that company is domiciled, whether it's within the EU, outside the EU, and so on and so forth. So the idea of information at the level of products is something which kind of starts with an awful lot of potential. The reason why I say there's a difference between what product level disclosure currently is and what it could be is the challenge is to unleash that potential or unlock it. So if we talk about product level disclosure, sustainability, information about products, the first thing that kind of comes to mind are product labels, right? So you can think any form of eco label, you can think of fair trade labels, you can think of various types of labels like that. So like I said, I work on uncertainty communication. If you look at that, if you take a step back and kind of look at the label ecosystem as a way of trying to communicate information or vehicle information about products, that's not necessarily the best information best way to design an information ecosystem, right? There's going to be issues about transparency, issues about understandability, issues about comparability, issues about perhaps trust in labels. There might be so many that people are going to have trouble understanding what they are. There's going to be issues about mixing facts and values, which I'm guessing we're going to be talking about a little bit later, and issues about the kind of patchwork kind of area of kind of character of product. And those are kind of issues that we're kind of familiar with if we move away from sustainability, right? So if you open the book called Nudge by Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein, so the Nobel Prize winning economist and the prominent legal scholar, the first version in 2008, they're going to say quite a lot about the importance of harmonizing or standardizing billing information. And in fact, if you look at electronic bills, at least in many EU countries, they're harmonized. So we can actually, it's easy for consumers to compare. If you look at what the CSRD was trying to do, not for product level disclosure, but for company level disclosure, there was an awful lot of different ratings, or there is an awful lot of different ratings in the investor space. The CSRD was supposed to bring some sort of harmonization and help kind of standardize so things were more comparable, more understandable, and so on and so forth. So the equivalent of that for sustainability on the product level would be some form of standardization, right? Some form of what we call in the report a scorecard, essentially something that's going to give standardized information about sustainability characteristics for every product in a way where you can compare between products.
Let's just, I want to come back to a lot of that, including the standards question, but the scorecard is actually critical to your analysis. And essentially, there's a scorecard per product with distributed information gathering. But actually, this is one of the reports that I've had the joy of reading, which isn't just saying, here's our methodology, follow us, and then not everyone else, and you'll succeed, which there are too many reports. So you don't have a recommended methodology for a scorecard, but it is absolutely critical to the success of product level supporting. Could you just explain why, and if companies are interested, where they would look to for that methodology?
Yeah, so thanks. It's a great question. So this is a programmatic report. It's written by kind of academics, I should say. We've had some interviews with several practitioners of different types. But yeah, we're not proposing what should be in the scorecard. We're setting down the principles. And the idea is you can kind of experts in the various areas, so people who are experts in the environmental space, maybe the ILO, people who are experts in various types of human rights spaces or social spaces and so on and so forth, can provide the precise kind of indicators that should be on the scorecard. Why is the scorecard important? That has to do with a kind of better doing the information design part better, right? So harmonization basically means it's much easier for people to compare. Another reason why harmonization is better is because quite a lot of labels mix up two different dimensions, right? The fact dimension and the value dimension. So for instance, if you think about certifications like B Corp, which was on your product, which was on your program several weeks ago, they're going to have methodologies they're basically going to do two things. They're going to collect information, and then they're going to kind of use various systems, perhaps a point system, perhaps a threshold system, perhaps they're moving from one to another to turn that information into a single certificate, right? But in doing that sort of calculation, they're basically weighing off various sustainability dimensions. They're saying which one's most important between, I don't know, CO2 emissions and human rights, or how much you need of each. Those are value judgments. They're not fact judgments. With a scorecard system, you could just provide the factual judgments, and then leave the value judgments to whoever is using the scorecard. What would that mean for companies? It means that it saves them from having to make those sorts of value judgments. What would they need in their scorecard? They were just going to need some basic, objective, in a certain sense, indicators. The typical indicators on the environmental front, when work that's already going on in the EU and in various national governments already suggest some of those, right? So CO2 emissions is one which is very well known, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. More work is going to be required on social indicators. We know what the dimensions are going to be. Then there's just going to be a question of precisely how you would want to calculate those things, or which particular indicator would correspond to which dimension. We can talk about particular examples. Some of them are given in the report.
I think many people in the sustainability space have got the argument about life cycle assessment, that a lot of certainly environmental impact, arguably social impact, look at technology companies, certainly for their products, is downstream after the product has left the building, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of people out there that would be attracted to this approach. But is the science of life cycle assessment good enough, or getting good enough, for us to be able to really be able to do this product by product?
Yeah, so there are several things you can put on scorecards. As I said, you can put social factors, you can put environmental factors, and in a certain sense, life cycle assessment is almost like a third type of factor, right? So one of the things that we argue about scorecards in the paper is that they're really good at doing upstream calculations, right? So just kind of how you kind of set out what the idea is. I think it's relatively clear, but worth reminding anyway. If you open up some of the latest sustainability reports, especially the ones which have been done according to the last CRD, because some companies have reported, and you look at some of the things that they're promising to improve, for instance, CO2 emissions in the future, quite a lot of them are basically saying that they're going to ask their suppliers for product level information on CO2. Okay? So if you have a scorecard system where all products have scorecards, even intermediate products, that's essentially the proposal, then a company, when it has to work out what the indicators are for its own products it's producing, is only really going to need to work out the sustainability impact or sustainability credentials for its own operations, because it can use the information on the input scorecards and just pass that through, right? So for the case of CO2, it's particularly easy. The CO2 in its products is basically going to have to be the CO2 in its operations plus the CO2 that it can just read off the scorecards for an input product. So that's at
the heart of why your paper claims that this can square disclosure with competitiveness, that there's less burden, less anti-competitiveness that some suggest. I'm not saying myself that exists, but some suggest is there. Now, that's quite a bold claim. You even put it in the title of this paper. So I think you've started down that road in your last answer, but let me give you a chance to say explicitly why this is a less burdensome, more competitiveness approach.
Yeah, so let me just say this claim is this paper is a kind of it takes a fully scientific approach. So we don't take any sides on whether the claims which are made about competitiveness are true or false. We're just taking them at face value. And similarly, on the burdensome, each of us can have our own opinions. And I don't even want anyone to know my opinion on this. This is not what's being put on. So it makes two claims on competitiveness, the paper. One is the very simple claim that if we're looking at information given at the product level, then that sort of information is going to be there for every product, including products which are made outside the EU, made in the US. Even if they have a carve out, there's still going to be that type of information that information is going to be there for those products. We'll talk about what that information will look like perhaps in a second. So the competitiveness argument is basically, it comes immediately from the fact we're working at the product level. Okay? The burdensome argument draws on the fact that when you look at kind of some of the things which are particularly burdensome, some of the things which are difficult, quite a lot of them are going upstream. So think due diligence, think scope 3. And the point about the scorecard possibility, something you don't have if you have product labels, is because you basically have the factual information on any particular indicator you want there. It's kind of easy to pass it forward. I'm not the accounting person in our team, but I'm told that there are kind of standard accounting methods for working out the costs, the inputs, how much they cost, and how they're related to your outputs. Well, this is essentially kind of doing the same thing, except your inputs are going to be CO2 or some sort of biodiversity impact, wage fairness, human rights respect, whatever you want that's in the sustainability space.
A lot of the concern about competitiveness is about small businesses and suppliers. And in the current regime, if we take CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, what the legislation says is that the purchasers, the big companies, have a responsibility to share the burden and to help their suppliers to be able to comply, and many of them are. What you're saying in this report, if I've understood it correctly, is each company on its own just has to report its own operations, and that makes it less burdensome for some. But doesn't that, for the small businesses and the suppliers, put extra burden on them because they're being required or obliged to provide information, but they're not part of a value chain relationship which is going to help them to do so? How are they going to get the help or the support to do it? Or is hard like you just got to do it? What's your message about that?
Yeah. So this might be a good point to kind of bring in the third dimension of the proposal, which was how to deal with non-reporting. And then that's going to allow me to answer that question in a little bit more detail. Yeah. So the first kind of thing, you think about it as a journey, right? The first thing you think about when you think of product reporting is labels. Okay, they're not very good. We more or less understood. We should have something which is standardized. We move to something standardized. We realize that whereas labels were mainly thought of for consumers, and we could talk about to what extent standardized scorecards can be used by consumers later. Once you have standardized scorecards, they can be used to kind of go down the supply chain. But then you have the issue that many of these supply chains are going to clearly go outside of Europe, and there are going to be many reasons why you can expect non-reporting. And what the proposal does for non-reporting is to make sure that silence doesn't mean escape from scrutiny. So how does it do that? It basically, if you have a farm, for instance, I don't know, that's producing a particular type of product in a particular type of region or a particular type of size, and it doesn't report, they're going to be best and worst class ranges for, say, CO2 emissions, but you can do this for any one of the indicators for that type of product, that type of farm, that type of region. So no information crops up on that product scorecard automatically, but the reporter doesn't have to do anything, automatically as uncertainty. Okay, and that uncertainty, once you have this kind of automatic pass on from one point in a supply chain further down, that uncertainty is going to be propagated down and finish off in the final product, which is seen by the consumer. Okay. And here is where we kind of tie in with decades of research in the behavioral sciences, behavioral economics, cognitive science, and so forth. Scientific evidence basically tells you that if you have a situation where you have some people who are reporting and some people who aren't, and you can see that they're not, and not only that lack of reporting comes in the form of uncertainty, people treat that as a negative signal. People are averse to it. People don't like it. which basically means that that's going to be a kind of negative tick for the products which have that uncertainty in, right? So it's going to be an incentivization for farms to make sure that there's as little uncertainty in their reports. Okay? Now, if I'm a big farm and I'm reporting everything about my own operations, then I'm going to want to make sure that my suppliers are going to be doing the same. And the best way of doing that is helping them in ways similar to the ways we're helping them now, right? But the point about the product level scorecard system is because it turns up in something that final stakeholders, consumers, but also government public procurement are going to see straight out, and the lack of reporting turns out to something you're going to see straight out. That strengthens the hand of those at the top, kind of, or at the bottom of the supply chain, the last people who are producing the product, to go to their suppliers and ask them to put more information, to help them do more reporting, and this is a thing which, as far as I understand, quite a lot of firms find it difficult, to continue doing that all the way down, right? Because suppliers, farms that I've had conversations with, they're typically pretty good with their tier 1 suppliers, but once we go down to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, it becomes much more difficult, right? So you want a mechanism that's going to keep on, pushing that incentivization for reporting and sustainability performance, all the way up the supply chain.
There's a lot of people listening who have followed the debates about green claims, the controversy there was before the summer when the last negotiations on the EU Green Claims Directive were halted. But this is clearly there's a momentum behind getting companies to substantiate their green claims. And yet research for the European Commission shows that 42% of product green claims are either misleading or unsubstantiated. If companies can't even get their marketing right on their products, how do you say they're going to get right a disclosure regime that will be rigorous, robust, and accurate?
Yeah, so great question. Let me just turn it around, right? So the way I like to present the scorecard idea is with the analogy with nutritional content of food. Okay, so think about your food packaging. If you look at your food packaging, there's going to be a table. It's going to be a pretty uninspiring, objective, a little bit scientific table. Probably you're not going to understand many of the things in it, though it's pretty useful to have if you have to be in a regime where you have, I don't know, low calories or less saturated fats. It's useful to have that sort of table. A good way to think about the product scorecard system is to have something similar, the same sort of rigor, the same sort of validation kind of required, and we can talk about those validation mechanisms later if you want to, but for sustainability credentials, okay? That's relevant. I'll just say why that's relevant to green claims in a second, but just that kind of ties into the role of the scorecard with respect to everything else. So in France and in several other European countries, you're going to know that there are efforts to turn the nutritional table into something slightly more marketing-y that consumers can understand. There are apps. Apparently, there are AI recommendations for how you should be eating, which are going to look at your nutritional table. You can imagine the same sort of ecosystem evolving for sustainability. Once we have, let's call them sustainability tables, right? The equivalent of nutritional tables, but for scorecards, you can imagine there are going to be apps. There might be several. There might be one that's more pushed towards environmental, one that's cares more about social, a mix of the two. You can imagine all of that type of ecosystem. All of those apps in the nutritional case, they can't say anything that's not already said in the nutritional table. And in fact, there is, as I'm guessing many of your listeners are aware, there is a nutritional claims regulation that says that no company can make nutritional claims that are not backed up by their nutritional tables, which are legally binding documents in inverted commas. Well, you can imagine doing the green claim, as you kind of pointed out, the green claims legislation has been a little bit sidelined recently. But if you have scorecards, then having green claims regulation, which is basically modeled on nutritional claims regulation, has the same relationship with product level scorecards that nutritional claims has with nutritional tables, is quite envisageable.
As you rightly say, it's only as good as the data that's put in, the integrity of data that's put in the first place by the company. You're, let's say, an informed consumer. Do you believe green claims when you in the supermarket looking at the products?
No, but so the whole point about this, the scorecard is clearly any data on it has to be kind of. The important thing is that it's trusted. So the important thing is that it has to be true, which means that it has to be validated. So it's not the scorecard shouldn't be thought of as a claim. It's not something. It should be thought of as a nutritional table. So if on the back of my cereal packet there's a nutritional table, and I go home in my home chemistry set, I check how much kilocalories there are, and it doesn't correspond to the table, then there's a problem, right? So it's going to be the same with sustainability credentials. If they report, then this is one of the advantages of allowing non-reporting, which turns up as visible uncertainty. If companies report on the scorecard, that report has to be backed up, true. If they can't, they can choose not to report.
You did answer no at the start to my question. How do we get from here to there, though? I've been involved in the whole standards debate. It's taken over 10 years, both to get to European sustainability reporting standards and to the International Sustainability Standards Board. It's been a painstaking, sometimes painful process, but as Europe and as the world, we've got to a point there. But that's all about companies reporting sustainability as companies. And so you're looking at what is quite a radical idea in some ways, making the case why it could be a much more effective one. But what's the sort of change process whereby you get from today to that becoming the norm at some point tomorrow?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's probably not one right answer for this. There are probably several ways. I think a bottom-up process could be building sector-level consortia, which we sometimes find. The important point is to push the standardization first, and to avoid each one going in their own direction, kind of introducing their own label or their own certification, which is kind of uncomparable with others, right? So you can imagine scorecards, and in a certain sense, the digital product passports, in the context of the eco-design legislation, are probably perhaps going to be these for at least some environmental factors. You can imagine scorecards on a sector level. And then you would want to make sure that these sectors were coherent amongst themselves, so that there's a recognition that I don't know, the automobile section is also going to require scorecards which are similar to the sectors which provide the raw materials for the automobile sector. That would be a bottom-up way of doing it. A kind of top-down way of doing it would be to try, in the context of finalizing the eco-design legislation, to try and insert some of the insights from our report at that point, right? So, for instance, Their way of dealing with uncertainty is typically to use median values. I understand there's been some discussion about that. So I know the French authorities don't precisely agree. Perhaps there can be talk there. The use of what we call distributed reporting to go down the supply chain with scope 3. That's not incompatible with anything that's been said. I'm not quite sure whether it's been discussed. And clearly social dimensions, essentially more or less, if you want, even just taking the main social dimensions in the ESRS for CSRD and trying to translate them to something which are indicator-like, that's the sort of thing it's doable. And there's going to be a question of the political will, of course.
Final question. Of course, all the companies that listen to and watch this podcast are reporting with integrity and good faith to the very best of their ability.
Of course.
But let's just imagine there's a company out there that says, well, this is very good because I can showcase my best, most sustainable products, and product by product can get a lot of information out there, but I can hide my negative impacts elsewhere in the company that never go to light, the biggest risks, the biggest negative impacts. What's to stop a company getting away with that?
Yeah, if I understand the question, the idea is they're going to put forward their good side and try and hide their bad side. The universal nature of the scorecard system is deliberately designed to avoid that. So here's a fact that it's been known for decades in the psychological literature. You find it in countless airport bookshop psychology books. People react more strongly to negative news than positive news, right? So losses loom larger than gains. That's the kind of maxim, right? So if you have a label kind of ecosystem which only shows you the good cases, then it's kind of easier for firms to hide the bad cases. If you have a scorecard which tells them everything about all of their products, if there was some kind of bad news there, it would have to show up on some of the scorecards. If it doesn't show up on the scorecards, then they're going to be lying on their scorecard, and then there's going to be the typical consequences of being found out for that. So it's going to have to show up somewhere. So in a certain sense, what's strong about this is the capacity to kind of point out the bad cases and avoid kind of attention shuffling only to the good parts.
Good answer. In this podcast, we've heard the claim that you can divide off facts from values, and that companies are going to report facts, but the values are for the reader and the user to interpret. We've heard that a product level approach could be less burdensome for those that adopt that argument by focusing on each company reporting on their own operations. We've heard that there is still integrity in the information that needs to be inputted, but perhaps it's a better approach in terms of managing uncertainty and incentivizing moving to greater levels of certainty. And we've heard that the way that this might be pursued is, yes, taking some of the current developments, including the digital product passport in the EU, as quite an interesting tool that could be used to advance this practice, but also very much a bottom-up practice where companies and sectors of companies and company associations could pilot and test this out themselves and build it. The HEC Paris report squaring disclosure, regulation and competitiveness is available now on their website, and to its author, Brian Hill. Thank you very much for being with us on Frankly Speaking today.
Thank you very much, Richard.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the responsible business podcast from Frank Bold, the public interest law firm. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you'll also share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. Remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again so much to Brian Hill and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.